welcome. Before we begin, it may help to know that Buddhist parables were never meant to give answers. They weren't designed to tell people how to live their lives or what to believe. Instead, they are simple stories, often ordinary ones, meant to create a small pause in the mind, a pause where we recognize ourselves. These stories don't ask for our agreement or effort. They're simply offered. And sometimes something quietly resonates. We'll begin with the first parable, known as the two monks and the woman. Two monks were traveling together on a long journey. They had taken a vow never to touch a woman. As they walked, they came to a river. At the water's edge stood a woman, unable to cross. The current was strong, and she was afraid of being swept away. The monks paused. Without a word, one of the monks stepped forward. He lifted the woman onto his back, carried her carefully across the river, and gently set her down on the other side. The monks continued on their journey in silence. Hours passed. Eventually, the second monk could no longer contain himself. He turned to the first and said, "How could you do that? We took a vow never to touch a woman. How could you break it?" The first monk looked at him calmly and replied, "I put her down by the river hours ago. And yet, here you are, still carrying her." Many people recognize something familiar in this story, not in the crossing of the river itself, but in what follows afterwards. Have you ever noticed a tendency to replay conversations again and again? Moments you wish you'd handled differently, words you keep revisiting, or an awkward interaction that returns each time you try to rest. In modern life, we often put things down physically, yet continue to carry them mentally. The event itself may have lasted only seconds, but the mind can carry it for hours or days, sometimes much longer. This story isn't telling us that rules don't matter, and it isn't telling us that our actions have no consequences. It's pointing to something much more profound and meaningful, that much of our distress doesn't come from what happened, but from what we keep holding on to long after it's over. In daily life, this might show up as replaying social interactions, overanalyzing mistakes, mentally arguing with people who aren't there, or punishing ourselves long after a moment has passed. What I've always loved about this parable is that it gently asks, when you reflect upon your own life, what are you still carrying? And is it helping you or holding you back? Letting go doesn't have to mean that you approve past actions. It also doesn't mean that you are avoiding responsibilities or pretending something didn't matter. It simply means that we are free to recognize when the mind is holding something longer than it needs to, and choosing, softly, to put it down. The beauty of this practice is that there is no need to force the mind to let go. Often, it's enough to notice, I'm still carrying this with me. And in that noticing, something naturally begins to loosen. Just as the first monk put the woman down at the river, we can learn slowly and imperfectly to put certain thoughts down too. Not all at once, not perfectly, just enough to maintain our peace. Some parables speak less about what happens and more about what we assume is happening. They point toward the subtle ways in which the mind has a tendency to fill in gaps, often without us noticing. This is one of those stories, a parable known as the empty boat. A monk was rowing his boat across a wide lake early one morning. During his journey, a thick mist had drifted in to lay over the water. Visibility was low, and the lake itself was quiet. As he moved forward, another boat suddenly emerged from the fog and crashed into his. The monk felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. He was ready to shout, ready to blame the careless person who had steered directly into him. But as the boats drifted apart, he saw that the other boat was empty. No one had been rowing it. No one had intended him harm. The anger that had risen so quickly had nowhere left to land. There is something almost universally familiar about this particular story. Have you ever noticed how quickly irritation can arise? How it can cloud our judgment? It can shape our perceptions before the full picture has even had a chance to emerge. A sharp email, a car pulling out suddenly, a message that feels abrupt or dismissive. We have all experienced ways in which the mind fills in intention, assuming carelessness, disrespect, or even direct malice. Often our minds can jump to false conclusions in a matter of seconds. In those moments, the emotional response can feel both very real and very justified. And yet, like the monk on the lake, we may later discover that much of what we reacted to was assumption rather than fact. This parable isn't suggesting that nothing ever matters or that harm never occurs. It's quietly pointing to how often our distress comes, not from events themselves, but from the meaning we, ourselves, attach to them. In modern life, empty boats can look like a message sent in haste, someone's tone misread through a screen, or actions taken without awareness of their impact. When we assume intention, the emotional charge tends to follow immediately. But when that assumption loosens, even slightly, something else often softens too, not because we force calm, but because the story we were reacting to is no longer as solid as it first appeared. In this story, the monk didn't need to push his anger away. It dissolved on its own once there was nothing left for it to aim at. In daily life, noticing the possibility of an empty boat can sometimes create a small pause, a pause where certainty loosens, where reaction slows, where the nervous system finds a little more space. Of course, not every situation will be an empty boat, but sometimes, realizing that one might be, is enough to change how the moment is carried, just enough to steady the waters. Our next parable is known as the Angry Man and the Gift, and quietly explores how emotion moves and what happens when it has nowhere to land. One day, a man approached the Buddha filled with anger. He screamed insults. He criticized the Buddha harshly. He did everything to try and provoke a response. The Buddha listened quietly, without interruption. When the man finally paused, the Buddha asked him a simple question. If someone offers you a gift, he said, and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong? The man hesitated, then replied, It remains with the person who offered it. The Buddha nodded gently and smiled. And in that same way, he said, your anger shall remain with you. Many people will be able to relate to the theme of this story. Have you ever noticed how emotions can be passed towards you, through words, through tone, through behavior, almost like an offering? Have you noticed moments where irritation, blame, or frustration seems to arrive at your door unexpectedly? Perhaps through a comment, a look, or something said in passing. And have you noticed how quickly the body can react before there's time to choose a response? This parable isn't asking for emotional suppression, and it isn't suggesting we tolerate the negativity of others. It's pointing to something much quieter. That emotions, like gifts, still require participation, and that we have a choice as to whether or not we engage with someone else's negativity or drama. In modern life, this can show up as absorbing someone else's stress, carrying irritation that wasn't yours to begin with, or replaying another person's anger long after the interaction has ended. When anger is offered and immediately taken in, it tends to stay active. But when it is rejected, when it's noticed without ownership, it often has nothing to hold on to. Not because we resist it, but because we no longer carry it forward. In this story, the Buddha didn't argue with the angry man. He didn't try to reason with or correct him. He didn't try to change his mind. He simply pointed to where the anger was resting. In daily life, noticing what we're carrying and what may not belong to us can create a small but meaningful shift. Often, that is enough for the weight to begin returning to wherever it came from. This next story, known as the taut string, quietly explores what happens when striving becomes the strain. A monk was struggling deeply with his meditation practice. He sat for long hours. He forced his attention to remain fixed. He believed that if he just applied enough effort, profound insight and clarity would inevitably arrive. Seeing this, the Buddha asked him a question. "Tell me," he said, "when you tune a stringed instrument, what happens if the string is pulled too tight?" The monk replied, "It snaps." "And what if the string is too loose?" the Buddha asked. "If the string is too loose, then it won't play at all." The Buddha nodded gently. Only when the string is neither too tight nor too loose will it be able to make music. Everyone will have noticed moments where striving to achieve a goal starts to feel exhausting. Times when you're trying so hard to focus, to improve, to calm the mind, that the tension quietly builds instead. Have you noticed how strain can creep in when the goal becomes getting it right, rather than simply being present and enjoying the process? And on the other side, have you noticed moments where effort drops away entirely, where things feel unfocused, scattered, or adrift? This parable isn't about discouraging hard work, and it isn't praising passivity. The theme of the taut string points us towards the principle of balance. In our often busy and goal-orientated modern world, the taut string can appear in a number of ways. By pushing through exhaustion, forcing productivity when the body is already strained, or by trying to control thoughts rather than noticing them. On the other hand, the loose string can be experienced as disengagement, avoidance, or by drifting away from what matters. The invitation here isn't to choose one over the other, but to notice where balance naturally lies. Often, it isn't found through force, but through sensitivity, through listening, through adjusting, through easing the grip just enough to enable the mind to breathe. Music doesn't come from tension alone, nor does it come from looseness. It comes from relationship, from a felt sense of what's needed in the moment. In daily life, noticing when effort has become strain can be a gentle turning point, not toward doing less or doing more, but toward doing things with a little more kindness to ourselves. Sometimes, that small adjustment is all it takes for the mind to begin playing again. Some parables don't try to take pain away. Instead, they gently change the way in which we view it. The parable known as the mustard seed is one of those stories. A woman named Kisa Gotami lost her young child. Overwhelmed with grief, she went from house to house carrying the child in her arms, asking if anyone could help. Eventually, she was brought to the Buddha. She begged him to bring her child back to life. The Buddha listened quietly and then said, "I can help you. But first, bring me a mustard seed from a household that has never known death." Hope returned to her face. She went from home to home, asking for a mustard seed. Every household was willing to give her one, but in each home there had been loss, a parent, a child, a partner. As the day passed, she began to understand. She returned to the Buddha without the mustard seed. And in that understanding, something within her grief began to shift. Many will recognize something deeply human in this particular story. Have you ever felt as though your pain sets you apart from everyone else? As though what you're carrying is somehow heavier or lonelier or more unfair than what others seem to bear? Have you noticed how suffering can narrow the world, making it feel as though you're standing alone inside it? In moments of loss, disappointment, or heartbreak, the mind often whispers, "Why is this happening to me?" This parable doesn't try to minimize our grief or to offer comfort through elaborate explanation. It gently reveals something else instead, that suffering is not a personal failure and not a punishment, but part of the shared fabric of being human. In modern life, the recognition of this principle can soften the sense of isolation during loss, the feeling of being singled out by pain, the belief that others are coping effortlessly. When we glimpse the universality of suffering, something often changes, not because the pain disappears, but because it no longer feels like it belongs to us alone. And in that shared space, grief can begin to breathe and the healing process can begin. Of course, the mustard seed was never the point. What Kisa Gotami discovered was that her suffering was not unique and not isolating in the way it first appeared. In daily life, remembering this doesn't remove our pain, but it can ease the sense of separation that often makes pain harder to carry. Sometimes, knowing that suffering is shared isn't an answer, but it can be a quiet companion. And for many people, that companionship is enough to help the heart take its next breath. Our next parable, known as the raft, quietly explores the difference between using something and holding on to it. A man came to the edge of a wide river. The water was deep and dangerous, and there was no bridge in sight. Gathering branches and rope, he built himself a raft. Using it carefully, he crossed the river safely and reached the far shore. Standing there, he looked back at the water. Unsure what to do next, he lifted the raft onto his shoulders and continued walking, carrying it with him wherever he went, in case he needed it again. When the Buddha told this story, he asked a simple question. If a raft has helped you cross the river, is it meant to be carried forever? The theme of this parable will resonate with many. Have you ever noticed yourself holding tightly to something that once helped you, even when it no longer fits the situation you're in now? It could be a way of coping, a rule you set for yourself, a practice that once brought relief. Have you noticed how tools can quietly turn into burdens when they're carried beyond their moment? And how letting go of them can sometimes feel strangely uncomfortable, even when they're no longer needed? This story isn't telling us to abandon what has helped us in the past. The raft mattered. Without it, the crossing would not have been possible. But the story gently reminds us that usefulness has a context. In modern life, rafts can look like routines that once supported us, strategies we come to rely upon automatically, beliefs about how we should be coping with our struggles. What helped us across one river may not be what we need when we come to face the next stretch of water. And sometimes, the weight we feel comes not from the journey itself, but from what we're still carrying. Letting go of the raft doesn't mean it was wrong to build it. It means recognizing when it has served its purpose. In daily life, noticing when something has shifted, when support has become strain, can be a gentle act of wisdom, not through rejection, but through appreciation. And sometimes, setting something down with gratitude is what allows the journey to continue more lightly. Our next story, known as the poisoned arrow, quietly explores what happens when the search for answers comes at the cost of relief. A man was struck by a poisoned arrow. Those around him rushed over to help, ready to remove the arrow and treat his wound. But the man stopped them. First, he said, he needed to know who had shot the arrow. Was it a man or a woman? Were they tall or short? From which village? He wanted to know what kind of bow had been used, what type of arrow, what material it was made from, and indeed, why they had shot the arrow in the first place. Was it through malice, or as a consequence of recklessness? The Buddha said that if the man insisted on having all his questions answered first, he would die before the arrow was ever removed. This parable contains a theme that many will be able to relate to. Have you ever noticed moments where the mind insists on understanding everything before allowing anything to ease? Times when questions multiply. Why am I like this? How did this start? Whose fault is it? What does it say about me? Have you noticed how the search for certainty can sometimes become endless, even when the discomfort is already present? And how relief feels postponed until every question feels answered? This parable isn't saying that questions are wrong, and it isn't dismissing understanding. It's gently pointing to timing. When understanding becomes a requirement before care is allowed, suffering often lingers longer than it needs to. Sometimes, the most compassionate response is not to solve the story, but to tend to the wound. The Buddha didn't say the man's questions were meaningless, only that they came too late. In daily life, noticing when the mind is searching for answers instead of allowing relief can be a gentle turning point, not away from curiosity, but toward care. Sometimes, easing the pain doesn't require knowing why it's there. Sometimes, removing the arrow first is enough, and the questions, if they still matter, can wait. The wild horse of the mind is a parable that quietly explores the difference in how the mind responds when it is met with force, compared to when it is met with understanding. The Buddha once compared the untamed mind to a wild horse. A horse that has never been trained will bolt, resist, and exhaust itself. If it is beaten or forced, it becomes fearful. If it is ignored, it remains unruly. But when approached patiently, with steadiness and care, the horse slowly learns to trust. Over time, it begins to respond, not through domination, not through force, but through relationship. The horse learns not because it is broken, but because it is met again and again without harm. Many people will see something familiar in this image. Have you ever noticed moments where the mind feels restless, scattered, or difficult to settle? Have you noticed how quickly frustration can arise? A sense that the mind should be calmer, more focused, more cooperative? And have you noticed what happens when the mind is met with force, with criticism, or impatience? Often, it doesn't settle, it tightens, or runs both faster and further. This parable isn't suggesting that the mind needs to be fixed, and at the same time, it isn't encouraging indulgence. It's pointing toward the approach. In modern life, training the mind often becomes an act of control, trying to silence thoughts, push feelings away, to try and force calm to appear. But like the wild horse, the mind tends to respond better when it's met with understanding and steadiness, rather than struggle, noticing without judgment, returning without punishment, beginning again without frustration. Over time, this kind of relationship often brings more ease than force ever could. A wild horse isn't tamed by anger, it's guided by consistency. In daily life, meeting the mind with a little more patience can quietly change how it behaves, not all at once, not perfectly, but gradually, through familiarity, through trust, through showing up again and again without harshness. Sometimes that gentle relationship is what allows the mind to begin walking beside us instead of pulling away. The next parable, known as the finger pointing at the moon, seeks to gently remind us where understanding actually resides. A teacher once pointed at the moon to show it to a student, but the student fixed their gaze on the teacher's finger. They studied its shape, its position, its movement. Seeing this, the teacher said, "Do not mistake the finger for the moon. The finger only points," he said. "The moon is what it points to." When reflecting upon the meaning of this particular parable, we may begin to recognize something familiar. Have you ever noticed moments where explanation begins to replace experience? Where thinking about something starts to stand in for actually feeling it? Have you noticed how easily attention can settle on words, ideas, or labels, while the living experience itself quietly waits in the background? Even ideas meant to help can become something the mind grips tightly. This parable isn't dismissing learning or language, and it isn't suggesting that concepts are useless. The finger matters. Without it, the moon might never be noticed. But the story gently reminds us that words and explanations are always pointing beyond themselves. In modern life, the finger can appear in a number of different ways, such as theories about the mind, explanations of emotion, even teachings meant to bring clarity. When attention rests only on the explanation, something essential can be missed. The calm, the sensation, the quiet presence of the experience itself. The finger is not wrong. It's simply not the destination. In daily life, noticing when attention has shifted from experience to explanation can be a gentle invitation. An invitation to look again, to feel rather than define, to notice what is already here before naming it. Sometimes turning toward the moon doesn't require more understanding, just a willingness to look up. Some parables present us with themes of understanding, whilst others focus upon the concept of care. Our final story is called The Burning House, and it quietly explores what it means to help without forcing, and to respond without fear. A man returned home to find his house on fire. Inside, his children were playing. They were so absorbed in their games that they didn't notice the flames spreading around them. The man called out, telling them the house was burning and that they needed to come outside quickly. But the children didn't respond. They were too focused on what they were doing. So the man paused for a moment and gathered his thoughts. It was then that he decided upon a different approach, and instead, he chose to speak to them differently. He told them there were many wonderful toys waiting for them outside, things he knew they would be curious about and would want to see. Hearing this, the children ran out of the house. Only once they were safe did the danger become clear. You may sense something in this story that resonates. Have you ever noticed how difficult it can be to hear advice when you're overwhelmed, afraid, or deeply absorbed in something else? Have you noticed moments where being told the truth directly felt too much to take in, even when it was meant to help? And have you noticed how care sometimes reaches us not through explanation, but through timing, tone, and approach? This parable isn't about deception or manipulation. It's about meeting people where they are. In modern life, this can show up in various ways, such as knowing when not to overwhelm someone with advice, offering support in a form that can be easily received, recognizing that care sometimes needs to be gentle rather than direct. The Father didn't change the truth. He changed how it was delivered, not to control, but to protect, not to persuade, but to help. Compassion isn't always loud, and it isn't always linear. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like choosing the right moment. In daily life, responding with care doesn't always mean saying everything we know. It can mean listening first, sensing what can be received, and allowing understanding to arrive in its own time. Just as the children left the house when the moment was right, sometimes safety and clarity arrive through gentleness. These parables we have just explored together don't arrive with instructions. They were never meant to be memorized or understood perfectly. They've been passed along for centuries because they tend to meet people where they already are. Some speak about letting go, others about effort, others about care, patience, or perspective. Different moments call for different stories, and often the one that stays is simply the one that was needed that day. If something resonated, it may continue to echo quietly in the background, and if nothing did, the stories can be allowed to pass on, just as they came. Thank you for spending this time here. Wherever the rest of your day takes you, may there be moments of ease, moments of steadiness, and moments where the mind is allowed to rest exactly as it is. And as always, if this space was helpful for you, you're very welcome to like or subscribe. It quietly helps these videos reach other people who might need them too. Take care, and thank you for being here.